Greetings all, this is Ohio Dan. Today's video is about something that may seem a little bit obscure, but I've noticed it as a problem on a lot of different levels, in real life and online really. And that is the ability to understand the difference between a descriptive statement and a normative or prescriptive statement. And what I'm talking about here may sound like it's trivial, but I find that it's consistently an issue with certain people who can't realize the difference between when you're describing how something is, which is a descriptive statement, obviously, versus telling someone what they ought to do or describing how things ought to be. Telling someone what they ought to do is a prescriptive statement, and trying to describe how things ought to be from a moral point of view, this is how things should be, that is a normative statement. A lot of people don't seem to be able to grasp the difference between these things. And I don't know whether it's a me problem, where I'm just not coming across the right way, or if a lot of you guys have noticed this as well. Because over the years, I've noticed a common problem where people aren't able to distinguish between a descriptive statement and a normative or prescriptive statement. Something I've said, in other words, gets misinterpreted as an endorsement for an idea, despite not having that intent at all. Sometimes I'll describe something, for example, that says, the situation in the United States is probably hopeless because we're $37 trillion in debt. I don't think we're going to get out of this mess unless we pass a balanced budget amendment yesterday. Neither political party is really reducing the deficit very much. So-called conservatives or Republicans really just are adding more to the deficit every year, even when they're supposedly in power. And you could read whatever you want into that at all. Again, that's just factual. That's just describing where things stand. This country is probably not going to overcome that. And so our days as a nation are limited. People will just be like, you hate America. What's wrong with you? Just vote for Trump. Or something of that nature. It's just very stupid, but yet people don't seem to be able to realize, no, it's not about hating the country. It's not about liking where things stand at all. It's about looking at things for what they are and realizing we're probably not going to fix this. Eventually, the value of the dollar is just going to keep going down and down and down, and people are going to struggle more and more to get by. And no matter what political party's in power, it seems like that's the way things are going to be. It's probably too late to save this country. And a lot of people just can't deal with that. A normative statement, on the other hand, would comment on how something ought to be based on a value judgment. Like, again, we should have passed a balanced budget amendment years ago. That's how things ought to be, but that's not how things are. And so when I'm describing how things actually are, I'm not making a normative statement. A normative statement is often in contrast to how something actually is in reality, while a prescriptive statement suggests taking a certain action to achieve a desired effect, which I've kind of learned not to make those kinds of statements in most cases, unless there's something specific going on where I'm helping someone try to troubleshoot a problem that's specific, like a computer won't turn on if I have any idea why that could be, anything specific like that. Then you can describe, or I should say prescribe, what people should do to try to fix something. But in general, I stay away from that because that just gets you into trouble when you tell people you need to do this in order to rectify a situation when the issue is usually complex and you may not understand all the details, or if things don't work out the way they want, they may come back and blame you. Prescriptive statements are generally not a good idea unless there's something specific that is a troubleshooting type of thing, or you're just explaining a process and this is how you should go about doing it. But usually you want to stay away, or at least I do, want to stay away from those statements. And normative statements about how things ought to be, I may make those kinds of statements more often, but a lot of that is pipe dream type of stuff, right? It should be the case that men and women can get together and have healthy, functional relationships. That's a normative statement, but that doesn't exactly make it happen either, does it? So you've got a lot of problems with both those types of statements. Normative statements, I think, are more fair game, but the problem lies when you're making descriptive statements, but people don't see it as you describing something. They think you're describing how things ought to be, or you're telling them what to do. And I've just noticed a lot of the time in my past, I can go way back with certain memories, certain examples where people just don't seem to understand that you're not telling them what they ought to do or describing how things ought to be. You're describing how things really are in reality. And it just seems like a lot of the time people can't deal with that. A descriptive statement only tries to provide information on what is happening without suggesting how something ought to be or what action should be taken. Many times people will confuse a descriptive statement with one that suggests what should be done, when really the issue is that they either don't like the observations that I'm making. And these are my sort of tentative conclusions, guys. A lot of the time people just don't want to deal with what you're saying. So you point something out and then they get mad about it and they act like you want it to be that way. It's kind of a defense mechanism because they can't deal with the ramifications of what you're saying right now. Again, do we accept that, yeah, Dan, you're right. Being $37 trillion in debt means that our country's probably done for. Or do you get mad at the person and be like, you hate America, because it's easier to do that, honestly. Then accept that probably everything that this country has stood for, up until recent times at least, is going to fall by the wayside because we're drowning in fucking debt, right? That's the harder, more difficult thing to do. And so I think a lot of people avoid the pain or the issues with that by just attacking you, even if you're just making a descriptive statement. Or it could also be in some cases that they just can't process the information logically, independent of their own opinions. And yes, I think this is more of a problem with women than it is with men. Women very easily confuse what they want to be true with what you're describing as true. They don't know the difference between their facts and their feelings. There are men that are this way, of course, as well. But for women especially, they think that you're describing how things ought to be because they literally don't know the difference between that and just making a descriptive statement. To them, how things ought to be and how things are in their mind are the same. They don't get the difference between objective reality and subjective feelings a lot of the time. I'm not trying to pick on women too much in this video. Like, it's not strictly a gender issue because there are a number of men that are this way as well, and there are some women that aren't. But women especially, one of the differences between male and female nature is that men are generally better at understanding, distinguishing the difference between how they feel and what they want to see versus how things actually are. Women struggle with this a lot more from everything I've seen. And so especially if you're trying to point something out to a woman, she may not be able to see that what you're saying is factually correct because she's so stuck on what she wants to be true that she can't get beyond that. I notice especially there is a lot of gender influence with that. And there are women that can go beyond this, right? They can basically, I don't want to say be forced to learn, but through whatever means learn the difference between their feelings and the facts. But that is a key problem as well, is you either have people that don't want to deal with your observations, even though they could potentially do so. They're just not wanting to see, again, with my example, that being $37 trillion in debt probably means that you're done financially. They don't want to see that because their ideology and their belief system is built around something totally different. And so they have to kind of attack you. But overall, they're able to see the difference between a descriptive and a prescriptive or normative statement about how things ought to be. But then you have the people that literally just can't do it. It just doesn't compute. They don't know the difference between objective reality and their feelings. So those are two ideas. Those are two conclusions that I've drawn from being frustrated with this in the past. But basically what it boils down to is either the person's misinterpreting your words because they're in denial about the facts and they feel the need to attack your observations, or they actually lack that ability to distinguish between their opinions or their desires and what they want to be true versus reality. They just can't do it. Understanding the difference between these types of statements is critical to not misinterpreting someone's general intent and what that person's trying to convey, right? It's important to realize when this person seems to have a level head on his shoulders, he's pointing out what he sees to be true. I know that he doesn't want this to be the case, but he's right. This is where things stand. You could talk about a lot of different things beyond just the fiscal state of the United States. You could talk about certain things that relate to any kind of issue, whether it's politics or where things stand between men and women. I'm not going to belabor this video with more and more examples other than to say that it applies to a lot of things. But I've noticed that that's an issue that I've had. I don't know whether you guys have seen this as well, where you're just describing how things are, and people either want to get mad at you and say that you're glad that things are that way, and just assume that you want bad things to happen, basically. Or this is the desired outcome on your end, and so they blame you for it, or it just literally goes over their head. Again, women more often than men seem to have that problem. It goes over their head because what they want to be true is reality for them. And anything that contradicts that has to be a normative statement from their point of view. It has to be something that describes how things should be because they can't distinguish objective reality from how they want things to be. And then they project that onto you, basically, right? They assume that you have that same limitation in your thinking, and so you're also describing how you want things to be because that's the same thing as how things are. From their point of view, they use a lot of magical thinking, and it just doesn't really work. So I just want you guys to be aware of this, how important it is to realize when someone's describing something versus when someone's trying to say that this is how things should be, or you should or should not take a certain action. Those kinds of statements are totally different. And it's important to know where someone is coming from, to recognize their intent, and to see where it is that they're trying to make a point instead of making assumptions based on confusing what they want to be true with how things actually are and reading a bunch of things into it that really aren't there. Because I know I've had that happen to myself a lot. I still struggle with that with people. And maybe it's best just not to waste time really talking to people if they're going to immediately assume things like you're describing how things should be. So it's something to keep in mind. It's something to be able to distinguish, to realize the difference between when someone's describing something versus making some sort of value judgment or prescribing some sort of action if that's not actually what they're trying to do. If that's not actually the point of what they're saying.